Today's daf in Masechet Zevachim is 83, Pei Gimel, and he told me he got around 10 lines from the bottom of Pei Bet Amud Bet, Boy Rava, which is, sorry, I'll count it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 lines from the bottom. So I'm going slow because Nav is joining, but the the discussion of our Mishnah on Daf Pei Bet, yesterday's daf, was basically if you have blood of a karban that is supposed to be done on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, like almost all karbanot, right? So say a regular karban chatat, and you bring it inside the Beit HaMikdash, inside the Kodesh, the Kodesh HaKadashim, it passes the dam and it passes the karban, right? So yesterday we learned from the pasuk which says El ha, if you have blood, Hainava, and if you bring it El HaKodesh Penima, you bring the blood into the Kodesh inside, and we learned yesterday that meant two levels, either into the Kodesh or to the Kodesh HaKadashim, right? Either the Kodesh or Penima, that blood becomes puzzle. So again, you have a Karban Chatat, let's just say, or an Ola or a Shlamim. You're supposed to do it on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, and incorrectly you brought it inside. So then the blood becomes puzzle, and you can't use that blood for the Karban, right? That was the Mishnah. Ask Rava today. Interesting question. Boy, Rava. Ask Rava 10 lines. We're 10 lines from the bottom of Pei Bet Amabet. Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor v'Sa'ir Avodat Kochavim. What about these two unique carbonot? Remember, we learned all in Horiot about a Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor and a Sa'ir Avodat Kochavim, where part of the avoda of these carbonot was you would bring the blood inside the kodesh and sprinkle it at the parochet or on the mizbeach inside, right? So these are things where the blood is supposed to go inside the kodesh, not like a regular karban chatat. So what about these animals? Says Rava, if you hichnis daman lifnai v'lifnim, let's say you incorrectly bring the blood into the kodesh hakadashim, which you're not supposed to do, mahu, is that considered to be a violation of bringing blood inside? Mi Amrinan, do you say the pasuk says El HaKodesh Pnima? Now, you can't bring the blood into the Kodesh inside, which again meant the Kodesh or the Kodesh HaKadashim. And Kohecha Dekrina El HaKodesh Karina Le Pnima. If there's a problem bringing it into the Kodesh, there's a problem bringing it all the way in. Kohecha Delokrina El HaKodesh Lekrina Pnima. Odilma Shalobim Komamu. Or do you say, Miriam, we're 5 lines to the bottom of Pei Bet Amabet. I don't know if you already did that part, but the question that Rava asked is that the whole limud we're talking about here is that if you take the blood that's supposed to be put on the Mizbeach HaChitzon of a karban chatas or ola or asham or whatever, and you instead bring it inside the Kodesh or Kodesh HaKadashim, it passes the blood, right? But that, the pasuk said, El HaKodesh Pnima, the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadashim. What if it's blood from a Parhalam Davar Shel Tzibor, which is supposed to go into the Kodesh, and you brought it into the Kodesh HaKadashim? Does that, you say, oh, well, it's fine. It's not fine, but it's not puzzle because it was allowed to be brought into the Kodesh, or it went to the wrong place, Shalom Makoma. So that's the question. So says the Gemara, and we often say when the Gemara goes this way, it means this is how the opinion goes. Im Tim Salomar, if you're going to say that Shalom Makomanhu, that it's not in the right place. So the fact is that even though it's supposed to go to the Kodesh, it's not supposed to go to the Kodesh HaKodashim, and therefore the blood's in the wrong place and it's puzzle. What about Parvis Yom Kippurim? Right? So this is one level up. The Par and the Ser on Yom Kippur, if you recall, if you paid attention on Yom Kippur, you bring the animal and you bring it into the Kodesh HaKodashim between the Badei Aron, right? So there, not only are you supposed to bring it into the Kodesh, you're supposed to bring it into the Kodesh HaKodashim. What if the Kohen, Parvasar Yom Kippurim, shehiza midaman al habadim, you sprinkled the blood between the badim, between the poles of the aron, the hotzian lehechal, and then you took it outside, and you walked out to the hechal with the blood, and then you said, wait a second, let me go back in there. Nisan, and you go back inside. So you did the wrong thing, because once you went inside and did the thing, you're not supposed to go back a second time. But Mahu, what is the halacha in that case? This is presumably Rava's question. Mi amrinan, do you say, well, mikomanu? Right? The Kodesh Kodashim is the place for that blood. So you're not in the wrong place, you're just in the wrong time. Oh, Dilma, Hov, and Nafak, Nafak. What do you say? Once you left, meaning you went inside, you did what you're supposed to do, you walked out, you can't go back in. And so going back in would be considered going to the wrong place, and the blood would become puzzle. So that's the second question. The Imtim Salomar, we answer on the bottom line now. Ho'av Nafak v'Nafak. Right? Since you left the Kodesh HaKodashim, you're out of bounds. If you go back in there, you're in the wrong place. What about within the Kodesh itself? And this is a really interesting question, right? Because remember, within the Kodesh, you sprinkle the blood in two different places. First, you sprinkle it on the against the parochat, achat lamala, sheva lamata, right? The whole story, and then you put it on the mizbeach hazahav, inside the inside mizbeach. So let's say where am I? No, hov nafak nafak. Hiza midaman ala parochet. If let's say you sprinkle the blood on the parochet in the kodesh towards the kodesh kadashim, right? The parochet that separates between the kodesh and the kodesh kadashim, and then hotzion the mizbeach, and then you take it out in the mizbeach. Rashi points out the mizbeach has zahav, meaning the mizbeach that you're going to put 7 drops on top and 1 on each corner. And so you didn't leave the Kodesh. But then you go back, Nisan, and then you go back to the early inner place where you're not supposed to be, Mahu, right? Do you say, Hacha vadechad makomu? You didn't go anywhere wrong. You're in the same place. You're supposed to be in the Kodesh, and you're in the Kodesh. Odilma Yitzia Karina Bay, we call that a Yitzia too, because you're in the wrong place. You're in the right room, but the wrong place. Teiko, and we don't have a resolution of that question. So we don't have an answer. Right, this question would only come up in the Kodesh, because in the Kodesh there's 2 different places to sprinkle the blood, and the question is, are they equivalent? Obviously, a carbon that's done outside, you sprinkle all the blood on the Mizbeach, so there's no 2 places. So that is the end of that sugya. Now the Mishnah continued. We're at the 2 dots now on Pei Gimel Amud Bet, the first 2 dots, 3 lines down. It said Nichnas lechaper, right? So remember, our Mishnah said yesterday, I'm going to just read the Mishnah because it's important. The Mishnah said, if you go into the Kodesh, or into the Kodesh Kodashim, with the blood, in order to be mechaper, to sprinkle that blood and get a kapara, right? But let's say you stopped and you didn't do it. So there was a machloket in the Mishnah, right? The Tanakama Rebbe Eliezer said, Nichnas lechaper afa pishalo kiper pasul. Even though you didn't go through with the act, the fact that you walked in with the intention is enough to pasul the blood. And Rebbe Shimon said, no, it's only if you do the act. Ad sheyichaper. Says the Gemara in the Breita, what's the reason for this machloket? Tanya, we have a Breita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, look, what is when it says you go in l'chaper, does that mean you go in to do it, or you go in and did it, right? Is it you plan to do it and that's enough, and even if you didn't end up doing it, you were over, or you actually fulfilled the kapara? So it says Rabbi Eliezer, it says here, if you took the blood in l'chaper bakodesh, right? Again, we don't know if that word l'chaper means you did it or you intended to do it. But v'nemar lahalan, there's another pasuk by Yom Kippur that says, "V'chol adam lo yiyah b'oel moed b'va'ol lechaper b'kodesh." No human being should be in the Oel Moed when the Kohen Gadol comes in lechaper b'kodesh. Now, obviously, as Rashi points out, everyone had to leave before the Kohen came in to do the avoda. It wasn't like after the avoda; it was before the avoda, right? And so, ma lahalan b'shelo kiper, just like on Yom Kippur, everyone has to leave before you do the kapara. Afkan b'shelo kiper. Here too, when it says any blood that's brought in the chaper is pasul, it's telling you even if you didn't end up doing the kapara, if you just brought it in with that intention. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and that's the source. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon in the Breita, explaining his opinion, the Mishnah says, well, there's a different pasuk. Nemar kan lechaper, right? It says by bringing the blood in, that if you bring the blood in the chaper, it's pasul. But Nemar lahalan, it says by, again, this is by Yom Kippur, it says, Ve'et parachatat, ve'et se'ir chatat, if now, again, this is later in the Yom Kippur story, the blood of the chatat, the blood of the parachatat, and the blood of the se'ir, asher huva et damam lechaper, that you brought their blood in already to get a kapara, you should mix it together and pour it out outside, right? That's the end of the pasuk. But here, we're talking about after the fact, right? But we're talking about the shirayim of the blood after you already sprinkled them inside. So there, it's talking about the past tense. Malahalan bishekiper, just like by Yom Kippur, in this case, it's talking about where you already got a kapara from the blood, and it says the word lechaper. Afkan bishekiper. Here too, by blood that's put in the wrong place, it only passes if you actually try to get a kapara. But if you bring it in and then stop before you do the act, it won't passel it. That is Rabbi Shimon's explanation. It says, well, it seems likely. Basically, it seems like there's two psukim, right? The word lechaper sometimes means you're gonna get a kapara, and sometimes it means you got a kapara. So why does Rabbi Shimon say from one pasuk, and why does Rabbi Eliezer say from the other? B'maikam riflagi, what's the underlying machloket? If there's a pasuk that supports each one, how do you know which way to go? Answers the Gemara, Mar Savar. The first opinion is, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is, danin chutz michutz. You compare something done outside to something done outside. What does that mean? that the blood of the karban chatat or olah is supposed to be outside. The Torah says don't bring it inside. So that's an outside thing. And it's compared to the people. When we say people should leave the Ohel Moed, when the Kohen Gadol is there, they're going outside. So chutz michutz, and you don't compare vein danin chutz mi bifnim. The other pasuk was referring to the blood of the par of Yom Kippur and the Seir of Yom Kippur, which are brought inside the Beit HaMikdash, inside the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim. So that's really not comparable. So that's why Rebbe Eliezer says compare it to the pasuk that talks about leaving ahead of the avodah, as opposed to the pasuk talking about doing it after the avodah. And the other opinion, Rabbi Shimon's opinion is, Mar Savar, well, obviously one is talking about blood and one is talking about a human, right? So we should danin behema mi behema. Compare the blood that's brought inside to the blood of Yom Kippur, right? Which is an animal to an animal. Vein danim behema mi adam. One of the psukim is saying no people should be in the Ohel Moed when the Kohen Gadol goes in, but that's not comparable. So therefore, that pasuk is not a good comparison. You compare it to the blood of the animal, and the blood of the animal of Yom Kippur is saying you already did a kapara, and so therefore says Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Shimon, you're only chayiv if you already did the kapara. But if you bring blood, not chayiv, the blood's not pasul. If you bring it inside with the intention and you don't fulfill the intention. So that's the basis of the machloket. The third opinion in the Mishnah, now the second two dots on Pei Gimel, was Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, I'm going to read it back in the Mishnah again. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im ichnis shogeg kasher. That if you go in by mistake, it's kosher, right? Meaning you didn't realize it. With the implication being that if you went in on purpose, it would be pasul. But ask the Gemara, pasul and what, right? Hamnezid pasul. If you went in on purpose, it would be pasul. But how does he agree with which of the earlier opinions does he hold? Like there was a machloket Rebbe Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon, whether if you bring blood inside with the intention of sprinkling it and you didn't do it, lo kiper, is it pasul or not pasul? So b'she kiper or b'she lo kiper. Does Rabbi Yehuda agree with Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Eliezer? Do you have to actually do the act, b'mezid, or just go in on purpose with the intent to do the act? So what's the answer to that? Says the Gemara, I have a very creative, it's a beautiful Gemara. I have a very creative answer to the question. And you know what the answer is? A whole unrelated question. It says Rabbi Yirmiyah, I've got a whole nother Braita. This is a Braita, I think Rashi says in Torat Kohanim, if I'm correct. But anyways, it's somewhere. Yeah, Rashi's Hachi Garsina B'Torat Kohanim. Says Rabbi Yirmiyah, there's a Braita. Now Rabbi Yirmiyah quotes this Braita. Quotes the Braita, it says, Mimashma shenemar. Since the pasuk says, and this is the pasuk we've been quoting so far, vet parachatat, vet seira chatat, right? The parachatat and the seira of the chatat of Yom Kippur, asher huvat damam l'chaper b'kodesh. The words el ohel moed are not in the pasuk, right? You brought them inside to get a kapara b'kodesh, right? So this is the pasuk that we were quoting before that Rabbi Shimon said is a proof that when it says the chaper, it means you actually did the kapara. Right? Now the Braita in Torat Kohanim says, Ma tamalom v'hasoref. Well, why does it continue and say you have to burn it? We should know you burn it. Says Gemara, says the Braita, this is the continuation of, or maybe this is the Gemara talking. What do you mean, Ma tamalom v'hasoref? What do you mean, why does it say you burn it? Legufei yitzrich. You need to tell me you burn it to tell me you burn it, right? Meaning it didn't say elsewhere that you burn it. You're right. That's not what the Braita is asking. The Braita is saying, Ma tamalomar chatat chatat. Why does it repeat, right? In the pasuk it says, Parachatat vet seira chatat. Why does it say the word chatat twice? It should have said that par vet seira chatat maybe or whatever, but it could have said it one time. So why does it say chatat twice? This is a continuation of the Braita. It's telling you lefisha lo lamadnu ela lepar v'sair sheyom kippurim. And again, Rashi takes out the next words, but we can read them. Shisrafina beit hadeshem, but I'm going to kick them out. Rashi takes them out. We only would have known about the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur and the Par of Yom Kippur, mitamim bigadim, that the person who burns them is mitame bigadim, right, which we learned elsewhere. How do you know shar nisrafim minayim? How about other karbanot that have to be burned, other chataot that are burned abeit hadeshem, which is the area outside, right? They become pasul and you burn them. Minayin, how do I know that the Kohen who burns them also becomes tamei? Talmud Lomar chatat chatat. Therefore, it says the word chatat twice to tell you that this is not just true about the chataot of Yom Kippur. It's true about any chatat that's burned. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so this is a Braita in the Torat Kohanim, and that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Continues the Braita. You'll see why we're quoting it in a second. So far, it has nothing to do with us, right? But Rabbi Meir says, "Eino tzarich." So Rabbi Meir says to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't need a pasuk to tell me that any chatat that's burned makes the person tamei. Hareyu Omer, because the Torah says Ve'et parachatat, ve'et chatat, right? It says in the pasuk, the parachatat and the seir chatat that came lechaper bakodesh, right? The whole pasuk, remember we quoted earlier that asher huva et damam lechaper bakodesh. So it says Rabbi Meir, the pasuk is the parachatat, the seir chatat, she'ein tomalomer lechaper bakodesh. Ma tamalomer lechaper. Why does it say that the par that you brought to be mechaper? Everybody who reads the story of Yom Kippur knows that you bring the par and the seir to get a kapara. Why does the Torah say the extra words lichaper bakodesh? Limeid says, remember, that teaches you akol mitkaprim shasorfim mitamei begadim. It tells you that any karban that is brought as a kapara, meaning pretty much any chatat or other karban, that you then burn, it is mitamei begadim. So Rabbi Yehuda learned it out from the word chatat, and Rabbi Meir learns it out from the words lichaper. Now says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda lechaper lo mashmalei. Now, clearly, Rabbi Yehuda did not want to use the word lechaper to learn what Rabbi Meir learned from that word. My taima. Why did Rabbi Yehuda want to use the word lechaper? It must be because what we said earlier in the daf today. At the word lechaper, remember this was Rabbi Shimon's opinion, that the word lechaper is there to teach you that when you do a kapara, it means you already did the kapara. And therefore, when you bring blood inside, it's only puzzle if you already used it to sprinkle. If you brought in the blood and you said, wait a second, I'm doing the wrong thing, and you stopped before you did the act, that would not puzzle the blood. My time it must be that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Shimon that we quoted earlier in the daf, and says the word lechaper is there to teach you that when it talks about lechaper, it means you already did the kapara, and the blood that is brought in the wrong place is only puzzle if you actually did the act b'mezid. But if you bring in blood, this is the machlok in the Mishnah. If you bring in blood with the intention and you don't do it, Rabbi Shimon says in the Mishnah that you're patur, the blood is kosher. You can take the blood back out and use it. And Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Shimon, and so that's a beautiful proof from an unrelated brayta. Hadron alach kol Zevachim shnit arvu. Okay, starting now the 9th parak of Masechet Zevachim. We're getting pretty far along. Says the Mishnah, we've had this Mishnah before, we've quoted at least, HaMizbeach mikadesh et haro'ila. The Mizbeach is mikadesh, that which is appropriate for it. What does that mean? We'll see in the Gemara what it means, but meaning if you take something that's puzzle for the Mizbeach, but it's theoretically roy for the Mizbeach, I'll give you an example, we'll see in a second with the example, then you leave that thing on the Mizbeach. Let's say you take a piece of an ola, I'm giving you an example instead, that is tamei. Okay, so you shechted the ola, the animal became tamei, you brought it up onto the Mizbeach by mistake, and you realized your mistake, you leave it on the Mizbeach, because the Mizbeach is mikadesh, it adds holiness, it absorbs that which is ra'oi for the Mizbeach. Now, what is included in these parameters? So continues the Mishnah to explain the first words. Rabbi Yeshua says, Kol ha-ra'oi li'ishim, anything that is appropriate for the flames, anything that's supposed to go on the flames of the Mizbeach, im Allah lo yired. If it goes up, don't take it down. Shenemar, based on the pasuk that says, Hi ha'olah al mukta. It is an olah, and we'll see later in the tomorrow actually, the drasha al mukta, on the flame, right? I would mukta on the bonfire or something, right? It's the olah on the fire. Ma olah shiruya li'ishim, just like a karban olah is burned on the mizbeach. Im alta lo tered, you leave it up there even if it's not appropriate. Afkol shu ra'oi li'ishim im Allah lo yered. Now, of course, what are we excluding? What is not put on a fire? So we'll see later in the Mishnah, for example, liquids, right? So liquids are not put on the fire. If you bring a nisachim onto the mizbech, you pour them down into the hole, remember. You don't pour them on the fire. That would be a mistake, right? You put out the fire. So liquids don't get on the ishim. They're not burned on the pyre, if that's how you translate mukta, right? They're not burned on the bonfire. And so therefore, if you bring up nisachim by mistake, you have to take them down, right? That is the first opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Gamliel is a second opinion, and he says, no. Kol ha-ra'oi le-mizbeach. It's not anything that's ra'oi le-ishim. It's not ra'oi for fire. It's anything that's ra'oi to be brought on the mizbeach, im Allah lo yered. Why? Shenemar, because if you keep reading the pasuk, you stopped a little early. It says, Hi ha'olah al mukta al ha-mizbeach kol halayla, right? It says you put the thing, the olah, on the bonfire, on the mizbeach. So it says Rabbi Gamliel, the important word here is mizbeach. Anything that goes on the Mizbeach is kolut, is attached to the Mizbeach. And that's how you darshan it. Ma ola shehiru yala mizbeach, just like an ola goes on the mizbeach, and malta lo tered, and if it goes up, even if it's pasul, you don't take it down. Af kol davar shiru in the mizbeach, and malta lo tered. Any other object that's appropriate for the mizbeach, if you bring it up, you don't take it down. Continues the Mishnah. This is a very unusual Mishnah. It must be, it's like an early Mishnah where we speak it all out. Says the Mishnah, Ein bein divrei Rabbi Gamliel divrei Rabbi Yoshua el hadam v'hanisachim. The two things that they disagree about between Rabbi Gamliel's opinion that it's the mizbeach that's functional and Rabbi Yeshua's opinion that it's the fire that makes a difference are blood. I forgot about blood, right? Blood is not burned on the mizbeach. Blood might be poured on the mizbeach for many carbonot, but it's not burned on the mizbeach. And nisachim, and the liquid of the wine that you put on the mizbeach. Rabbi Gamliel omer lo yerdu. Rabbi Gamliel says if you bring up blood that's tamei, let's say, or you bring up yayin that's to be poured down that's tamei, then you don't take it down, you use it. And Rabbi Yeshua omer yerdu. And Rabbi Yeshua says no, take it off. Don't sprinkle it on the mizbeach. Don't pour the wine down. Take it off the mizbeach. This only applies to the parts that are burned on the fire. So that's the machloket Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel. Now, Rabbi Shimon says, I've got a little interesting detail to add to this machloket, because I think that it's a little bit more complicated. Says Rabbi Shimon, it depends on why you're bringing the liquid. And we'll see this more in the Gemara, but I'm going to read it first in the Mishnah. If you're bringing the nisachim because you care, you can bring a nidavav nisachim alone. Remember, nisachim are wine, right? If you just walk in and say, I want to dedicate, I don't have a carbon to bring, I want to dedicate wine to the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to see it's a machloket whether you can do that, but let's say you're allowed to do that. So Rabbi Shimon says that itself, if it was tamei by mistake, you can leave it on the mizbeach. The only issue with wine is that it's not the primary karban because it's secondary to the animal. So therefore, says Rabbi Shimon, if you have a situation where the zevach is kasher, the animal is kosher from the mizbeach, right? And the nisachim are psulim, but the nisachim that are brought with it became, let's say they became tamei, and you bring them both up onto the mizbeach. Or you have the opposite situation, where the nisachim are ksherim and the zevach is pasul. The wine is kosher, but the meat is pasul. Or afilo zevach psulim, or they're both pasul. And you bring them on the mizbeach, hazevach lo yered. Don't take down the animal. It seems to be everyone in the Mishnah agrees with that. Right? Rabbi Yehuda agrees with that. Rabbi Gamliel agrees with that. Not Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Gamliel both agree with that. V'hanisachim yerdu, but you take down the nisachim. Now that sounds a lot like the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, the first opinion in the Mishnah. But it's interesting that Rabbi Shimon only says it in the context where you have a karban with the nisachim. If you brought nisachim alone, it seems like he would agree with Rabbi Gamliel that you can leave them on the mizbeach. And the Gemara will, of course, discuss that. So that is the Mishnah. Turn the daf now to daf Pei Gimel Amud Bet, and says the Gemara, when you said in the first words in the Mishnah, Kol ha-ra'oi le-mizbeach, right? If it lo yered, it implies ra'oi lo in. If it's appropriate for the mizbeach, you can bring it up. She'ein ra'oi lo lo. But you leave it up, not bring it up. You leave it up. If it's not ra'oi for the mizbeach, you don't leave it up. What does that mean? What's not ra'oi for the mizbeach? Lemutei mai. What are you including there, or what are you excluding? Rav Papa. Well, it's a very unique case. It's lemutei kmatzim shlo kidshu b'kli. Think about it. Think about this case. You have a kometz of a mincha, right? Remember, a carbon mincha. You bring a pot of flour, and sorry, I lost my place. There we go. You bring a pot of flour and, right, say a pound of flour. I don't remember how much. A lot of flour. It's in a kli. You stick your hand in and you take out a kometz, right? That kometz is supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, but it doesn't get burnt on the mizbeach right from your hand. You first put it into a kli, into a vessel, and it's kodesh in the kli. Until you put that kometz in the kli, it's not ro'oi lemizbeach because it's still part of the original big mincha, right? It's not its own thing until you've put it into a kli and designated it, meaning if you put it back in and just open your hand, you could retake a kometz. It's not kodesh yet. So that is called something that is not ro'oi lemizbeach yet because it's not really a karban. It's not, remember that the mincha does not go on the mizbeach, only the kometz does. And this is not considered to be a kometz until you put it in a kli. So therefore, that is excluded. And if you carry that up to the mizbeach, you would have to take it off. You wouldn't put it on the mizbeach. So that's what Rav Papa said. Matkifla Ravina asked Ravina, 1 second. Ma'ishlami de Ula. What about, there's a halacha that Ula said, and they held Ula in very high regard, so they didn't want to disagree with them. And Ula talked about a case where you have a murei kachim kalin. You take the limbs of a kachim kalim. Now, it's a little complicated, but I'll try to make it simple. But kachim kalim, like let's say a shlamim, right? You shech the shlamim. What you're supposed to do, of course, is take the blood of that animal, sprinkle it on the mizbeach, then bring up the parts of the animal that are supposed to go on the mizbeach and eat the rest, right? But let's say you didn't sprinkle the blood. It was a long wait or something. And the blood is sitting there in the cup and they're mixing it together. But you were too fast. You brought up the emure kache kalim. You brought up the limbs of the kache kalim. Shehalan lifnei zrikat daman. You brought them up before you did zrika of the carbon. So this case, you would think it's very similar to taking the kmitza of the mincha without putting it in a vessel. Because the thing that makes the kmitza into the carbon is putting it into a kli. The thing that makes the bones of an animal into a carbon is sprinkling the blood, right? But before you sprinkle the blood, it's not official carbon yet. But still says Ula, lo yardu. You don't take them off the mizbeach, even though you put them up before zrika. Because naselach mizbeach, they become like bread of the mizbeach, meaning they become part of the mizbeach. So why don't you say the same thing about the mincha? Answers the Gemara. There's a big difference because hanach by the carbon by the kache kalim lo michasru maaseh begufayu. There's nothing missing in the actual piece of meat that you're holding. It just needs you to sprinkle the blood, but the meat is going to be the carbon, right? It's just that we're waiting for the blood to be sprinkled. But hani, this kmitza that you took from the mincha, mechasru maaseh begufayu, it is missing an action in its own self because it doesn't become the part that goes on the mizbeach until you put it into a kli. And so before you put it into the kli, it is not considered to be ra'oi for the mizbeach. And if you're olu, everybody agrees in our Mishnah that you would be yardu. Both Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, all the opinions in the Mishnah are that it would go down. Continues the Gemara now at the first two dots on Pei Gimel and Bet. Rabbi Yeshua says, "Kol haro'ei li'ishim." Now remember, there's one pasuk that they're both darshing. Pasuk says, "Al ha'olah al mokda al hamizbeach." Right? He ha'olah. It is the olah al mokda on the flame on the mizbeach. So Rabbi Yeshua said it depends on the flame, and Rabbi Gamliel said it depends on the mizbeach. Obviously, the question is going to be, it says both, right? So why does one Tana say one matters, one Tana says the other matters? So the Gemara is about to ask that. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yeshua Amar Kol Roy Lishim. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Gamliel Nami Achtiv Ola Al Mukta. Right? According to Rabbi Gamliel, says that the important word is Ola Al Mizbeach, anything that's roy from Mizbeach, but it says Al Mukta, it says on the flame. So why does it say on the flame? Says Rabbi Gamliel, that teaches you a completely different halacha. And that is the halacha of the hadure pukin. I think we've discussed this before, but pukin mean things that pop off, right? Anyone who's had a fire knows sometimes you put something on the fire and either there's a lot of liquid in it or I don't know why, it jumps up, right? So let's say you put a piece of meat on the mizbeach and it's, for whatever reason, it falls off the mizbeach, it bounces off the mizbeach, right? Do you put it back on? So it fell off the side of the mizbeach, right? You put a piece of meat on top, maybe the fire was near the edge, it exploded, and it jumped off the mizbeach. It was a dead animal, don't worry, but it fell off. So do you put it back on? Says Rabbi Gamliel, yes. And how do I know that? Because the pasuk says, al mokda, which is a beautiful drasha. The olah al mokda means the olah was on its bonfire, right? Literally its bonfire. You should say on the bonfire. So the drasha Rashi explains is that it was a piece of meat that was already on the fire. It's that pieces of meat fire, right? I mean, the meat was on the fire. It fell off the fire, burst off. You're supposed to put it back on. So Rabbi Gamliel uses the word mokda to tell you that pokin, the things that bounce off the mizbeach, that fly off the mizbeach, go back on. And the word mizbeach to tell you that things that are put on the mizbeach that are inappropriate, because say they're tamei, go back on. So let's read that inside. Says Rabbi Gamliel, Hahu la'aduri pokin huda'ata. The word mokta tells you that things that are bounce off go back on. The idach. So what does Rabbi Yehuda do with that? I'm sorry, Rabbi Yeshua do with that? La'aduri pokin minale nafkule mi'asher tochal ha'esh. Right? He says, well, anything that's eaten by the fire, which means the same implication. It has already been started to be eaten by the fire. The idach. So what does Rabbi Gamliel do with that? Humi baile la'akule olata machsir v'eta machsir kule kitoret. Now, I need that to tell you a different halacha, which is that if things bounce off the fire, you only put them back if they're a piece of an animal, if it's an ola. But if it's a piece of kitoret, right? Let's say you put incense on the mizbeach and it bounces off, you don't put that back on the mizbeach, you throw it away, you don't reuse it. And so, how do I know that? Because the pasuk says ola goes on, nothing else. The Tani, and that's in fact there's a braita. We quote the braita. Rabbi Chanina bar Menyumi Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said, Asher tochal ha'esh et ha'olah ala mizbeach. I don't know if that's a pasuk. No, those words are taken out. Asher tochal ha'esh et ha'olah. If the fire ate the olah, sorry, take out the next two words, ala mizbeach. Says the Braita, akule olah tamachsir v'atamachsir akule ketoret. You've only put back pieces of an olah that fell off. By olah, we don't mean just an olah, but we mean any animal. But you don't put back pieces of ketoret, of incense. Those are thrown away, basically, or put away, right? So that's what you need the pasuk for, the idach. And what does Rabbi Yeshua answer to that? If you need the pasuk to tell you that, how do you have an extra pasuk? He would say to you, look, lav mimela shma mina. I don't get it. You don't need two psukim. One to tell you, put the ola back on, and the second one to say, don't put the ketoret back on. All we have is one pasuk, and the one pasuk says, don't put the ketoret back on, and from that I understand you do put the ola back on, right? So from the fact that the Torah said, don't put the spices back on, I assume from there, I learned from there that you do put the animal back on, and therefore you basically have an extra pasuk, and that extra pasuk is there to tell you poke in. So where Rabbi Gamliel said, I need the pasuk to tell you poke in, Rabbi Yeshua says, I don't need the pasuk for that. So that
Now in the Chumash it does say asher tochal ha'esh et olah ala mizbeach. So you're saying that the Chumash is wrong? They shouldn't have those words ala mizbeach?
I'm saying the Gemara is wrong. They're not relevant. We're not darshing those words, right?
No, but the Gemara is just quoting the verse.
The Gemara is quoting a Braita, and the Braita, according to the Shita, does not have those words. So the important words, it doesn't matter, right? Obviously, but the important words that we're darshaning are the earlier words. Asher tochal ha'esh.
Okay, but they do that often at times, and it includes an entire pasuk. I don't know what the big deal is. So, but that's the pasuk in the Chumash. I mean, are they want to say here that those words shouldn't be in the Chumash?
Again, those words should not be in the Gemara. They should be in the Chumash. Well, they shouldn't be in the Gemara. But I didn't look, but I think maybe if you look in Yuma and in Menachot, we'll see what those Braitot have. They might have a different version, but I can't say for sure.
I don't know. I'm looking in the Chumash right now.
Right. But in the Gemara, they should not be there. So the Shita says to take those two words out of our Gemara. But there are probably others who disagree with the Shita, but that's who I have printed. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Gamliel said, wait a second. It says al ha'esh, al mukta, al hamizbeach. Anything that's away from the mizbeach, and again, the machloka between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel was things that are not put on the fire but go on the mizbeach, like blood and wine, right? So Rabbi Gamliel said, well, the important point here is al hamizbeach. So that's a really good point. It says Rabbi Yeshua Nami. So what is Rabbi Yeshua going to tell me? Hachtiv mizbeach. Right? It says al ha'esh. It says ola, hi ha'ola, al mukta, al hamizbeach. So what do you do with the word? It says mizbeach. Says Rabbi Yeshua, humi boile. That would be to tell you, my ka'amar rachmana kol ha'ra'oila mukta. Right? This is needed for the following statement. Right? It says, what is the reason that things that are ra'oi limukta are left on the mizbeach, are left on when you put them up improperly, mikadesh mizbeach. It's because the mizbeach made a kodesh, meaning anything that you put on ha'olah al mukta should stay there because it's al mizbeach, right? So it's not telling me anything that's al mizbeach. It's telling me the reason that you leave things on the mizbeach, even though they're inappropriate, they're tameh or they're lan or the yotze, is because the mizbeach makes them kodesh. So it's not describing what's left on, it's describing the mechanism. So what does Rabbi Gamliel say to that? Rabbi Gamliel say, you're right, you do need that. But there is mizbeach achri nichtiv. There's a whole nother pasuk. Rashi quotes the pasuk, kol hanogea b'mizbeach yikdash. Anything that touches the mizbeach becomes kodesh. So it says Rabbi Gamliel, I know that from another pasuk. I don't need al mizbeach here to tell me the reason you don't take it off is because it's put on the mizbeach. Therefore, I use al mizbeach to tell me that anything that's roi from the mizbeach stays up. So what does Rabbi Yeshua say about that other pasuk in Shmot about kol nogea b'mizbeach yikdash? He would say you need two psukim. Because chad lehecha dehaita l'shata kosher, v'chad lehecha dehaita l'shata kosher. One is talking about an animal or a karban, let's say, that once was kosher and then became pasul. So there, if you only had one pasuk, you would say an animal that was once kosher and then became pasul, you should leave it on the mizbeach. Let's say it was lan, right? You shechted the animal, you have the limbs, are supposed to be put on the mizbeach, they're kosher, but you leave it overnight. By the next morning, they're no longer kosher. If you put that on the mizbeach, maybe you leave it on. But what about a case where there was never a shata kosher, a case where it was pasul from the moment you shechted it? For example, let's say you shechted it with the thought of chutz lizmano. So from the second you shechted the animal, shechted the animal, it was pasul. So there, how would you know? You need two psukim. And idach, what does Rabbi Gamliel say to that? He would say, Kivan de psulininu, since look, they're pasul in both cases, whether it's lan, which is where there's a shata kosher, or it's chutz lizmano, which is pasul from the minute you shechted, they're both pasul. And the Rabbeinu Rachmana, the Torah says, if it's okay, if you put it on the mizbeach, leave it up. So therefore, loshna hayta lo shata kosher, loshna lo hayta lo shata kosher, there's no reason to think there's a difference. And so I don't really agree, says Rabbi Gamliel, that you need two psukim. And since I don't think you need two psukim, one is extra, and it teaches me my halacha. The halacha that it teaches me is that anything that's put on the mizbeach, including blood and including wine, im Allah lo yered. And that's the machloket. The third opinion in the Mishnah was Rabbi Shimon. And we're up to now the third or last two dots in the page, which is like 15 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Shimon says the carbon is kosher if you bring a carbon and the nisachim with it, if one is pasul, it doesn't matter. You take off the nisachim, but you leave on the carbon. Tanya, now we have a braita which elaborates on Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says ola, right? It says he ha'ola. Says Rabbi Shimon, ma ola. The ola is the paradigm. Everything that is left on the mizbeach follows the ola. Just like an ola haba biglal atzma, ola is brought as its own thing, right? You don't bring an ola with another carbon. It's not a secondary carbon like the nisachim, right? So just like an ola comes for itself, afkola ba'im biglal atzman. So too, this rule of putting things back on the mizbeach if they fall off, if they are pasul, not putting them back, leaving things on the mizbeach if they're pasul, is also only true by things that are ba'im biglal atzman. Yatsu nisachim. It excludes the nisachim haba'im beglal zevach. Right? Nisachim in general are brought secondary to the zevach. Okay, so that is Rabbi Shimon's opinion that the pasuk says olah, it has to be a primary carbon. And as I said in the Mishnah, and we're going to see later, if you brought nisachim as a primary carbon, you just walked in one day and said, "I want to donate wine." That, according to Rabbi Shimon, would stay on the mizbeach because since it's not secondary to a carbon, it is the carbon. It has the same status, even though it's wine. So Rabbi Shimon says the problem is not wine or animal. The problem is whether it's primary or secondary. Now, so again, just to recap, because this is going to get a little confusing, right? If it's not confusing already, there's three opinions in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yoshua, who says anything that's ra'oi li'ishim, anything you put on the fire, which means an animal, not wine, right? Not blood. Rabbi Gamliel, who said mizbeach, anything you put on the mizbeach, including wine, including blood. Rabbi Shimon, who came along and said, well, it depends. Wine is okay, but only if it's brought primarily. If a wine is secondary to the carbon, then it doesn't stay up on the mizbeach if it's pasul, because it's a secondary thing, not a primary thing. Now, says the Braita, we got two more opinions. You ready for two more? Says the Braita, where am I? Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, okay? I don't know if we want the Shita, but the Shita adds the word Braita here, okay? Tanya, I mean. Tanya, says the Shita, come and learn a Braita. Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who's now a fourth opinion, says, Mitoch shenemar, remember it says at the end of Shemot, Kol Nogea b'Mizbeach Yikdash. Anything that touches the Mizbeach becomes Kodesh. Shomeani, so I would have concluded from that pasuk, Bein Ra'oi, Bein She'eno Ra'oi, whether the thing that's put on the Mizbeach is appropriate or not appropriate. I would have read that pasuk and said, anything that touches the Mizbeach, even if it shouldn't be there, it stays on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomar, therefore it says, now this is the next pasuk, but it says kvasim. It says kvasim in that later, right? It says not only what's ro'il mizbeach, but it says in the next pasuk, it says zeh asher. What are the exact words? I don't have a pasuk with me, but Rashi I think quoted it. Sorry.
זה אשר תעשה על המזבח,
Thank you.
כבשים בני שנה, שניים ליום תמיד.
Thank you very much. So the next pasuk says, this is what you put on the mizbeach, kvasim, right? Two kvasim, shnei kvasim, right? So ma kfasim ru'uyim. Well, since kfasim now teaches me that, oh, wait a second, the things you leave on the mizbeach have to be like kfasim. Kfasim are lambs, right, or sheep. Just like kfasim are meant to be a karban, af kol ra'oi. So too, it has to be something that is ra'oi to be a karban like kfasim. We'll see in a second what's being excluded. Rabbi Akiva says, he's a fifth opinion now. Wait a second. It says the word olah, right, in that pasuk. It says the word olah to tell you ma olah ru'uya, just like an olah is ru'uy to be a karban, af kol ru'uya. Now it says where my benayo. What's the difference between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva? But whether you use the word kfasim, which means lambs, and olah, which means a karban, says Rav Ada bar Ava, obviously, olah ta'ov, psula, ikabenayo. What about a bird, right? So if you learn it from the word kfasim, it means mammals, right? It means animals. So the only things that are okay are animals, which now would exclude, of course, wine and oil, right? But it would also exclude birds. And according to Rabbi Akiva, it's olah. It's based on being an olah, and since a bird is an olah, a bird would be included. Okay, so now we have two more opinions, right? One is that everything, the only things that you leave on the mizbech are animals, but not anything else, including birds. That's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. And Rabbi Akiva's opinion that animals means animals and birds, but we're going to see not flour, okay? Which is very similar to Rabbi Yeshua, but we'll see. We're going to keep going, right? Rabbi Yeshua, remember in the Mishnah, didn't talk about flour. Says the Gemara, now, before we get to all five of these opinions, Lamanda Maitile Mikfasim Achtiv Olah, right? Rabbi Yosef Glili said the word says kfasim, but it says the word olah right next to it. And says Rabbi Yosef Glili, well, because it has to say both. Ichtiv kfasim, lochtiv olah. If it had just said that the kfasim that are brought on the mizbeach should stay there and didn't say the word olah, havamina, I would have thought afilu michayim. Even if you bring a live animal onto the mizbeach, you should leave it up there and shecht it there, and you don't take it down, right? So therefore, katuv rachmana ola. Like let's be very clear. We're not talking about any animal. It's not every sheep. It's a sheep that's a karban, meaning it was brought as a sacrifice. So that's why it had to say the word olah. But the primary limitation here is the word kfasim. And about Rabbi Akiva, Lamanda Maitlemi Olah Hachtiv Kfasim. Rabbi Akiva said Olah. So what about the word Kfasim, right? Which implies only animals. Says Rabbi Akiva, Ichtiv Olah v'Chtiv Kfasim Avemin Afilu Mincha. I would have thought, well, Olah means Olah of the animal, Olah of a bird, Olah of a mincha, which is not an Olah, but I mean, it could be, but it's brought on the Mizbeach. So therefore, Katav Rachmanik Kfasim. Therefore, the Torah says kfasim say it has to be an animal. Now, birds are filtered by animals. So that's the opinions of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Ask the Gemara now. We're going to read a few more lines and then we'll stop. My ika, look, we're at the first wide line. My ika bin hani tnai lahani tnai. What's the difference between these Tanaim? Lahani tnai dematnitin, right? These Tanaim that we just quoted in the Braita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, right? They both make it taloi on being an animal, either just a mammal and excluding birds, Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion, or an animal or a bird, right? An animal or a bird, and excluding mincha. But our Mishnah, what's the difference between them and the Tana of our Mishnah, Hani Tznai de Matzniten? And it says Rav Papa, well, the difference between them is kmatzim shekachu b'kli ikabenayu. Let's say you have a kmitza of a mincha that you put it into a kli. Remember, we said earlier that if you didn't put the kmitza into the kli, everybody agrees. All five Tanaim agree that if it goes on the mizbeach, you take it down. But what if it's a kmitza that was put in a kli, and you basically have a kmitza in a cup, you bring it up to the mizbeach, and then someone says, "Wait, stop! It's tamei." So what's the difference? So the Tanai Didan, the Tanaim of our Mishnah, which is Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon, lo yardu, right? You don't take it down. But the Tana, did I get the third one right? Yeah, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon. Letznai de matnita yardu. I said it. Yeah, according to the Tana of the Braita, Matnita here means the Braita, not the Mishnah. It is yardu. According to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili, if it's a mincha, it goes off the mizbeach. And so I'm going to stop here. But we have five Tanaim, and you should remember them because tomorrow morning we're going to have to pick up on these five Tanaim. Okay, so I'm going to say them again quickly, and then let you guys go. There's Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, Rabbi Yoshua starts, and he says, Kol ha'ra'oi lemokda. It has to be ra'oi for the mizbeach to be burned on the fire, and that excludes things that don't go on the fire, like blood and nisachim, right? Rabbi Gamliel says, no, Kol ha'ra'oi lemizbeach, including blood, including nisachim. Rabbi Shimon says, well, it depends. Nisachim that come as a secondary thing, they go off the Mizbeach, like Rabbi Yeshua said. If it's a primary thing, they stay on like Rabbi Gamliel. Come along Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, who I think might have, I don't know if they lived earlier or not. I don't think so. Come along Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva and said, no, we disagree. It's not everything that's ra'oi for the Mizbeach or the fire. Not only is wine excluded, but minachot are for sure excluded. Flour, right? But in addition, and that's Rabbi Akiva, says only animals and birds. Rabbi Yosef Glili is the most strict. And he says only animals, meaning mammals. Birds, flour, wine, all of that is not kodesh by the Mizbeach. And if you bring it up and it's tameh, take it down. The only thing you leave up are the animals. And we will see that Rabbi Shlakish is going to summarize it for us tomorrow. So we'll stop here, 2 lines from the bottom. 7:45 a.m. tomorrow, God willing. Excuse me. Have a good night, everyone. Shavua Tov.